Hi, and welcome to the new season of Tethr's Customer Experience Podcast. I'm Robert Beasley, CEO of Tether. Today I have Matt Dixon and Ted McKenna with me. Matt and Ted are founding partners of customer research firm DCM Insights, and they have a new book out called The JOLT Effect, and we're going to talk about how they use Tether's conversation intelligence platform to examine sales interactions in a way that's never been done before. Matt, Ted, welcome. It's great to have you here today.
Great to be with you again. Thanks for the invite.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. So in the book, you talk about how the 2020 lockdown caused many sales meetings that were usually in person to move to online meetings, creating a unique opportunity for you to analyze and measure things that were happening in these conversations. What were your goals when you first started collecting and analyzing these sales calls, and what questions were you trying to answer?
I'll take a first swing at it, and then Ted, I'm sure you'll have, Robert, you know us well enough by now that we're going to pile on. And, we have time for one question.
Yeah.
So I think, it's funny because that was, it was such an interesting time, right? The whole world of business was kind of turned on its ear and upside down.
Way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I think it was, if we get down to it, it was a choice of like, do we do some new research or do we go learn how to bake sourdough bread and, watch Tiger King and all that good stuff, right? But I think, this was, as you put it well, this was a really unique time in the world of sales, which there were so many business trends that were kind of on a slow march upward. One of them was how much of the average sale happened on Zoom or Teams or WebEx or, different virtual platforms. And that was slowly increasing over time. And then I think with the pandemic, it just flipped completely to 100% because nobody could travel. And so all of those sales conversations went to virtual. And so that meant all the mundane conversations that were probably already on virtual, but also the really critical ones, the negotiations, the critical consensus building calls, as critical calls with the senior decision maker or your mobilizer. Those things were all happening on these virtual platforms, which created this kind of, I would think once in a lifetime opportunity for researchers like me and Ted to actually go out and study sales in a way it had never been studied before. Now, I think and Robert, you know this really well, obviously, CEO of Tether and in the conversation intelligence space, that sometimes, it can feel, it's like a mountain of data, potential insights, right, that you're looking at. And companies and people can kind of get lost in all that data. And so we had to go in with a very specific mission and objective. And I think the thing that Ted and I had been tracking as we said, hey, we got this golden opportunity, but what specifically do we study? What do sales leaders need help with right now? And one of the things Ted and I had been intrigued by and had been tracking over the past few years was the increase in deals being lost to no decision. And to be very clear, these are customers who go through the entire sales process, spend valuable seller time, right, and all the resources on the vendor side, but also a lot of their own time to engage with a salesperson, engage with a vendor, only to come up and do nothing. And we've been kind of tracking this sort of anecdotally, and as we're talking to sales leaders and salespeople about what's hard selling today, and it felt like that one was moving up the charts in terms of what was really pressing and difficult for folks to solve. In years past, if folks, listeners of the podcast might know the work around the Challenger sale that came out more than a decade ago. And that was about a different problem. What do we do in this world where customers have all this information and they can learn on their own? They can learn about Tether and all Tether's competitors, and then they call up your salesperson, they force you to compete on price. Well, that makes things really hard for the salesperson. So the answer was, you've got to challenge customer thinking. And so our goal here was to try to figure out, in a world where left to their own devices, customers seem to be less and less likely to make decisions, even after investing a lot of their own time in the sales process. What are the best sellers doing differently to avoid that happening to them? What's their playbook for success?
Yeah, I'd say even before we sort of got to the point where we thought, of all the things we're studying, losses might have been the most interesting terrain for us to go and examine, which in and of itself was kind of different than what we would have normally done, where you're just studying high performance. You could easily argue this is probably the biggest study of losses ever conducted. But I think the other thing to consider at that moment in time was on the buyer side, just how much things have changed as well. Even consider us ourselves as retail consumers, where you might have been more hesitant to walk into a store, but therefore, when you go to buy, you might pick up the phone and call somebody in a way you might not have otherwise. And so much has been made of this notion that individuals, and this is true, I think, across the spectrum of purchasing, on certainly on the B2C side, where we can jump on Amazon or any number of different retailers and buy things on our own without talking to a salesperson. Increasingly true on the B2B side too, as well. So I think part of what we're trying to get at is, look, this is a pretty anxious moment in general for buyers, where budgets might be constrained and they're sort of worried about paychecks and all sorts of things because of pandemic related situations. But also, what are they now relying on salespeople for within these conversations that might be very telling in these moments when they have to pick up the phone and call, even when they have ability to buy on their own.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ted. So what was different about this research compared to some of the research that you've done in the past?
Yeah, it's funny. We put together this slide, which I'll describe it to everyone. But it's sort of, we titled it the Moore's Law of Sales Research. And so if you go back to, I think a lot of the listeners of the show would be familiar with Neil Rackham's work, Spin Selling, which he wrote back in the early 80s. That was based on research his team did back in the late 70s. And that was really the gold standard for great sales research. Neil and his team of, I think it was about 12 people, physically sat in on 32,000, I think, sales calls, went into those meetings with clipboards, taking notes, filling out their observational checklist. And it took them 10 years to finish that study. And I think it was $1.5 million, maybe $2.5 million in today's dollars, but really took a long time, 30 plus thousand sales calls. And for a really long time, that was, again, the gold standard. You fast forward to the research we did around the Challenger sale, which, again, as I mentioned before, is more than a decade old now. Mm-hmm. State of the art then shifted from, sitting in the customer's office with a clipboard and taking notes to maybe we could do quantitative research and couple that with targeted interviews. And so we collected data from, to begin with, 6,000 salespeople. That research goes on to this day, data on hundreds of thousands of B2B salespeople out there around the world. But the initial study was 6,000 sellers. But it took a team of, I would say there were probably, Ted was a part of this team as well, maybe 20 people who cycled through that research team over the 2 years, plus it took us to finish that study. And that was before we started writing the book and sharing the findings. So it's still pretty labor intensive, and from a sample size perspective, a lot of variables, a lot of data collected, and arguably a lot more efficient than what Neil Rackham did back in the 70s and 80s, but still pretty time consuming. And you fast forward to this study using Tethr's technology that Ted and I conducted here in 2020 or very recently. You're talking about a much smaller team. It was me, Ted. We've had resources, obviously, from the Tethr data science team, Tom Shepard, most notably, but others who had a hand in the research. But it was a smaller team. And it was a massive data set and a massive number of variables that we analyzed in the study, and did it in a very constrained period of time. I mean, if you look at from start, when we decided to do it, we went to the team at Tethr and said, hey, we got an idea. Like, what do you think about this? And you guys said, yeah, that sounds cool. Let's go for it. From that point to when the book was actually in the publisher's hands was like less than 2 years. And so that's kind of crazy to think about that. And it is like this Moore's Law of like, I don't know what the next advance will be, but it feels like you wait a few minutes and everything gets twice as fast. The data sets get enormous, and what's possible today is just fascinating. Well, the last thing I'll say, and I know Ted wants to jump in, but the last thing I'll say on this is, I think one of the real key differences here, Robert, is that, this is like where the rubber hits the road in sales, is that conversation between the customer and the salesperson, and being able to actually get to that rubber hits the road moment is so much more powerful than even what we did in the past with surveys, which of course have lots of bias, right? Well, it requires you to recall what happened, and there's some, selection bias and confirmation bias and sample bias. Like, there is no bias when you're literally looking at like a conversation between a salesperson and a customer. So it's a very different kind of study as well.
Great point.
Yeah, no, I was going to say to that point, one of the, of course, simple differences, of course, is that when you study it through conversation analytics software, is you see both sides of the conversation. So you don't just get somebody's perspective from weeks or months past as to how somebody might have behaved, but you're also seeing from the buyer themselves how they're expressing different sentiments and how they're reacting to the seller. So that's gold for us as researchers, because it provides additional context, a lot more additional context as to, what's going on and why is it occurring, how are they reacting, and how is things changing, how are things evolving across the course of that interaction. But there's a blessing and curse with unstructured data as well. It's sort of this ocean of complexity. You now have to make decisions. You have, models that are, literally tens of thousands of rows and, thousands and thousands of columns, and you're trying to make sense of it all at the same time. It gets really complex quickly. And so it requires some of the sort of complex type of models that, thank God, Tom was able to supply us with and help us to weed through. But it is that unstructured element. It is a little bit of a, man, there's a lot here. There's this ocean of information you have to try to weed through and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, it's complex, and taking something that's unstructured, a conversation, and putting structure to it, very complicated. So once you guys decided to focus on customer indecision, what did you have to do? How did you have to adjust your research to drill into it and really kind of understand and test your theories about what was going on?
Ted, I'll let you take it first. I'll do the pile-on act on this one.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the first simplest thing is, we're able to isolate those moments between high, medium, and low levels of indecision. And so then you can use that as a filter for understanding how does the seller change what they're doing in those different moments. So we were able to first measure indecision and measure it on a relative scale. So we can see situations when it was high, medium, or low, and that alone was very powerful. But then being able to filter in and say, okay, we can see in the data that indecision becomes, we call it cold feet at different points. Cold feet becomes one of the biggest swing variables in the study itself. So then that helps us to isolate those moments and say, okay, in those swing variable moments, what things separate the best from the rest in those situations? And you start to see variables bubble to the top that maybe before you might have missed or maybe not have thought it was quite as important. But when you see it in the lens of indecision and how much difference it makes in those moments, it starts to really help you understand, what specifically is driving overperformance.
Yeah, the thing I would add here to what Ted said is, I think what's so interesting is I've used this analogy before, metaphor before. Robert knows I love a good metaphor, but and you can go share this with all of our friends at Tether who know the same. It's like before, up until recently, we had the Hubble Space Telescope, which provided these really deep pictures into the universe and answered big questions about like who we are and like how did this all begin and these things. And then they put the Webb telescope like a million miles past the moon or something. Now we're and it's like a lot of that stuff was always there, but we never had the technology to find it and to look that deeply. And I think that Tether and conversation intelligence is a lot like that. It's some of these things were out there already, because when you get down to it, we talk about indecision and what the best salespeople do differently. It's really about a deeper and better understanding that high performers have of human nature and why people do the sometimes silly things that they do, and or not do in this case, the things you expect them to do. And so I think what we did was we took a lot of these findings coming out of Tether, now the research, and then what Ted and I did is it kind of went back to the social science. So I'm sitting looking at here on my desk a mountain of behavioral economics and human psychology and cognitive psychology research to really try to understand what makes people indecisive. Like, what are the things that people get wrapped around the axle about? Why does this matter so much to people? Why does it cause them, even when they deep down, they're looking at a decision and they know this is going to make them better off, and they still choose to do nothing? Why is that? And so I think there were a lot of counterintuitive things that came out of the research. And so we need to rely on all that research into just how human beings are wired. Because we're not, at the end of the day, we're talking about customers, but customers are people after all, and they do things that we don't expect them to do sometimes. And so we had to rely on all that research to kind of explain what we were finding.
Right. Now, that's a great segue into my next question, which is about what did the Tether platform do to enable you to be able to get these insights? What role did Tether play in all of that?
Well, I'll start here, Ted. You can pick up here. And I know Ted was deep in Tether and using the platform, and applying it to the research throughout. But I would say at the highest level, I would say there's probably two big things. I think one is that when you get down to it, indecision can be assessed and measured and identified through a lot of emotions that are expressed on the part of the customer. And a lot of those emotions are difficult to measure, actually. They don't come down to simple keywords. They come down to, in some cases, you take in the English language alone, hundreds or thousands of different phrases and utterances and the way that's expressed. And also, and how do you teach a machine to find those? And then also to find examples that might be similar, but are not indicating that emotion. So if you take something like frustration or confusion or hesitancy or skepticism or, any of these things are, according to social science, indicators of indecision. And I think what we came in, we were able to benefit from was the years of work that the team at Tether, long before Ted and I arrived to do this research, had already invested in building world-class categories that could identify not just those emotions, but also behaviors on the part of salespeople that turned out to be quite relevant and statistically significant in the model. Then, of course, it was the power and the flexibility of the analytics, and there was a lot beyond the initial findings that I kind of slipped into the mode of starting to weave together that story and put together the content and write it up. And there were times that Ted was going back into Tether and rerunning analyses, and just the speed and flexibility to be able to answer very specific questions very quickly versus like, well, we got this question and then we got to go hire a data scientist and we got to go wait 2 weeks and pay a ton of money to get the answer on this. I mean, neither Ted nor I are coders, right? But we were able to, as lay people, if you will, granted, lay people were quite familiar with Tether, go in and actually ask questions of the platform and get pretty fast and very accurate answers that really helped us keep moving the ball down the field in terms of the research.
Yeah, I would just add, Tether's, I think, really does a good job. The technology is really good at understanding context of conversation. So It's not just that somebody has said something, but also you're understanding that in context of everything else going on within that discussion at the given time. And for us as researchers, that manifests in combinations of categories. So Matt's talking about individual concepts and individual behaviors that you can measure. What becomes very powerful, but also adds to complexity, is when you start to combine those things together and understand what happens in sequence when these things are occurring across the course of a conversation. Quite literally, Tom built a proprietary math solver in order to handle the complexity of all the data that goes into that. So we couldn't have possibly crunched this amount of data without Tether's capabilities on that front. And it's just really kind of a rich, deep understanding of, to Matt's point earlier, you get to this sort of understanding of human behavior because you can see kind of, again, what's going on in almost like call and response form, if you will, across the course of that conversation.
That's a great point, Ted. So why don't we finish today with one last question? Basically, talk to the audience about how companies can measure indecision levels in their interactions with prospects and customers.
I was going to say give Tether a call and they'll help you out. But look, it's funny. Robert, I'll give you here's a funny but very true. And I'm not rolling anybody under the bus here, but we have a head of sales enablement at a company, a tech company that Ted and I have been talking to. And she read an early release version of the book and said, boy, this is really cool. And they use a platform. They've used it for conversation intelligence for some time. And said, our team went and looked and they couldn't find it. They couldn't find any decision. Said, well, step one is spend 5 years building world-class categories. Yeah, step two is read 30 years of social science, then tell us what you found. And so
exactly.
And this is not like, look, we're, as Robert said, we're with Ted and I are with DCM Insights. And so this is not empty flattery, but the answer is that measuring this stuff is really hard. And I think a great step for companies would be to give Tether a call and say, hey, we've got sales conversation. You know what? We do lose a lot to no decision. And we think this is a problem. And you know what? Over the next couple of years, it's going to get worse, not better with the expected downturn. And so give Tether a call because a lot of these scores and these categories are in the platform, and it's easy to then pinpoint where it's happening, what effect it's having. And then, as we'll talk about, I think in later episodes, what are the behaviors that our bestsellers are using to avoid that? And is everybody using those things, or where do we need to target our coaching and our training?
I think we can say with confidence that it's happening probably more often than most listeners would think. It is
Yeah.
there, even if you can't yet see it. So the question isn't really necessarily how do you measure it so much as how do you measure the relative level of indecision and then understand the effect it's having on your people. And so I'd agree with Matt, but I think part of the reason it becomes complex to measure is because it is not always explicit. These are, we talk about these like deep, dark fears that these buyers are having in these moments. They're not always so explicit as to say, hey, I'm really fearful of this situation. There's lots of nuance as to how they articulate it, which is why, when you have these categories, to Matt's point earlier, that have been trained for years and years and years and years, all the different ways in which somebody might articulate a given level of uncertainty, it becomes a lot easier, of course, if you have technology like Tethr. But at the base level, if you're just sort of trying to eyeball it, you are looking for different levels of uncertainty, and just know that it's there in varying levels at different points.
Well, that specific company I've referenced before, I think what their team did was look for how many times our customers saying, I can't make a decision, or I am indecisive. And the answer is like, none of your customers are going to say that.
Right.
But we know that most of us actually are indecisive, and that's true of our customers as well. So it's a little bit like carbon monoxide. You can't see it, you can't touch it, you can taste it, but it's out there and it's very dangerous for your sales conversion.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we'll pick up on that next time. Matt, Ted, I want to thank you for your time today. Enjoyed the conversation. If you want to learn more, go to tethr.com/jolt and be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you can catch the next episode where we'll continue the conversation with Matt and Ted and learn more about customer indecision.